Let us stand as we are able and sing together our scripture song.
Open your ears, O faithful people, open your ears and hear God's word. Open your hearts, O royal priesthood, God has come to you. Torah, Torah, hallelujah. Torah, Torah, hallelujah. Torah, Torah, hallelujah. God has spoken to the people, hallelujah. God has spoken words of wisdom, hallelujah. God has spoken to the people, hallelujah. God has spoken words of wisdom, hallelujah. They who have ears to hear the message, they who have ears, now let them hear. They who have learned the way of wisdom, let them hear God's word. Torah, Torah, hallelujah. Torah, Torah, hallelujah. Torah, Torah, hallelujah.
Be seated as we listen to the story.
Good morning, everyone. A passage from Genesis 18, 1-15, and 21, 1-7. May we be equipped by these words to walk in love for God, ourselves, our neighbors, all people, and all God's creation. The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre, while he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat. He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to greet them and bowed deeply. He said, "Sirs, if you would be so kind, don't just pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought so you may wash your feet and refresh yourselves under the tree. Let me offer you a little bread so you will feel stronger, and after that you may leave your servant and go on your way, since you have visited your servant." They responded, "Fine, do just as you have said." So Abraham hurried to Sarah at his tent and said, "Hurry, knead 3 seahs of the finest flour and make some baked goods." Abraham ran to the cattle, took a healthy young calf and gave it to a young servant, who prepared it quickly. Then Abraham took butter, milk, and the calf that had been prepared, put the food in front of them, and stood under the tree near them as they ate. They said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Right here in the tent." Then one of the men said, "I will definitely return to you about this time next year. Then your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were both very old. Sarah was no longer menstruating, so Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "I'm no longer able to have children, and my husband's old." The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Me give birth at my age?' Is anything too difficult for the Lord? When I return to you about this time next year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied and said, I didn't laugh," because she was frightened. But he said, "No, you laughed." The Lord was attentive to Sarah, just as he had said, and the Lord carried out just what he had promised her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham when he was old, at the very time God had told him. Abraham named his son, the one Sarah bore him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, just as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, "God has given me laughter, Everyone who hears about it will laugh at me, she said. Who could have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse sons? But now I have given birth to a son when he was old. The living God is with us.
And for all your creation, thanks be to God.
So Abraham and Sarah have been waiting a really long time for God to make good on that promise. They've been waiting 25 years since God first called them to leave their home, to leave their family behind, because God told them that there were plans for them. A plan to give them a land that would be their own and to make them parents of a great nation. So for 25 years, they have wandered and wondered when God would finally make good on this promise. Because even though they stepped out in faith, things have not unfolded quite as they had imagined they would. They are still nomads. They are still strangers in a strange land. And that's almost certainly, I imagine, why Abraham, we see him being so eager to go and offer hospitality to these three strangers. Because after 25 years, he knows the vulnerability and the need when you are traveling in the desert, that you need to rely on the kindness of folks, that it's a vulnerable thing to do. So they're still nomads, and still they have no child of their own. And it seems like a pretty big problem to that second part of the promise. If they don't have a child, how in the world can they be parents of a great nation? As time was passing during that 25 years, there was a moment where Sarah thought she better take matters into her own hands. Some of us like to do that, right? Maybe you know this part of the story, right? She arranged for her husband Abraham to father a child with her Egyptian slave, Hagar, right? Because to Sarah, it seemed like this must be the only way possible for God to fulfill that promise. She's getting too old. This is an acceptable thing that people did in that time. And so maybe this is what God had in mind for how they would be parents. Ishmael was born, and if we read that part of the story, we see he brought so much joy to Abraham, so much delight. But for Sarah, the arrival of this child, which was so unfortunate, brought for her jealousy, envy, and bitterness. And that really played out in a terrible way for this family. And this wasn't what God had in mind for the fulfillment of that promise. But Abraham and Sarah, they had made that choice to follow God's call. Their dream, I imagine, was that this venture, the stepping out in faith, would bring them the hoped-for future that they wanted for themselves. But then life happened, as it does. Kate Wohler, we used her blessings during Lent this year, right, during the season of Lent. Blessings for the Lives We Actually Have was the book. I was listening to an interview that she was doing recently on her podcast, and she said something so beautiful that I think captures this reality. In this interview, she said, "I used to imagine that life was a series of choices, by sheer grit and charisma and advanced degrees, that I'd be able to get through life unscathed, And then illness strikes, as it did for Kate. She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of 35. And then an accident or a tragedy turns our world upside down. And then an ending comes to something we had thought was going to be a forever, or at least for most of the time. And then, in spite of our best efforts, our prayers, things just aren't going the way we really, really want them to, or the way we think they should be. Now, that ability to make choices, to think through them and choose for ourselves is part of what we have been gifted as humans. It's something that sets us apart from most other creatures. But this ability to choose our path in life, will not, in the end, protect us from life, from our own vulnerability, from our own mortality. To quote that famous line that maybe many of us studied in high school, I know I did, from Robert Burns, his poem, right? The best laid plans of mice and men oft go awry. And if we want to make that a little bit more contemporary, right, in spite of our best efforts, our best plans, life happens. So life has not turned out the way Abraham and Sarah thought it would when they first set out from their home 25 years ago. At some point, I would imagine they would have had to have made some kind of peace within themselves about this. But then these three strangers show up on their doorstep. Three strangers who seem to know a whole lot about their situation. And they make this bold and outrageous claim that Sarah can't help but laugh when she hears it. Because she knows, when we heard the detail in the story, right, she knows that it's physically impossible for her body to have a baby. But then, against all odds, it comes to be. I want to acknowledge that for some of us, Sarah's story can be a hard one, raise up some painful feelings, some big feelings for some of us. I think for any who have had miscarriages or struggled with infertility, for those who maybe on the other end of things, right, have had to deal with an unplanned or even unwanted pregnancy. The Bible talks a lot about fertility and connecting it with God's blessing, and that's really hard because life doesn't always happen that way for all of us. And that's just a truth that I think we need to name. What I hope that we can all hear in this story is that this is a promise that in life we can't ever imagine what God has in mind. I wonder, can we hear in Sarah's story the promise that impossible things might happen yet for us? It might not be the impossible thing that we want to have happen, because I'm sure if it was up to Abraham and Sarah, if it had been up to them to choose and decide the right time to have a kid, they probably would not have chosen to have a newborn at 100, right? We can argue about how accurate those biblical ages are, but I know even running after a toddler when I was getting close to 40, that was hard enough, right? So I can't imagine that's the timing they would have chosen. But there is the possibility, and the birth of Isaac asks us to believe that there is always the possibility that we can yet be surprised by God, no matter our age, no matter whether we think it's too late. Right? So your life, it might not look how you imagined it would at this stage, and there might be points you can think back where your life sure wasn't the way you thought or hoped it would be. But the thing about detours and setbacks and challenges, the things about when life happens to us, right, that makes us who we are. That is our story. And even when they leave us a little worse for wear, they have made us who we are, and so that there is value in those. And even when we didn't choose those things for ourselves, right, when life happens to us, it still invites a response, right? We have a choice in how we respond to the things that happen to us in life. And I want us to think about Sarah's response for just a moment. I think it's a good one to consider, right? Her response to laugh. Right? To laugh at the absurdity, to laugh about the pain, right? We know that some of the very best comedians are the ones who find a way to poke fun at the very worst things that can happen to us. Because sometimes laughter and humor is the only way to respond to something that seems impossible or something that is objectively terrible. That said, I will say that feeling sad and crying are perfectly acceptable responses as well, right? And sometimes we need both. We need to cry and laugh. The promise that we have in God, though, is always that as it was for Sarah, the first laugh, it will be followed by more laughter. It will be followed by laughter that is about joy and life, even in the midst of all that is hard and painful. something that gets lost in translation is what the name Isaac actually means. It's a name in Hebrew that means laughter, or he laughs. So think about that, right? They named their child Laughter. So that meant that any time Sarah was introducing her new baby, or they were talking about their child, she could tell the story of how his name was chosen and remember how she laughed at God when she was promised a son in her old age, but how now she laughs at her own lack of faith. And her laughter is that laughter that is full of life and joy, even though there is still hardness and pain in her story. I think many days it may seem as if it's too late, right? It's too late to keep hoping, to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep growing. But to be alive in God's story means daring to believe that it's not ever too late. And I think that's what we're invited to sit with today, and to think about some of these questions, right? Can we trust that God will surprise us yet? Can we trust that it's never too late to be surprised by God? Even if it might not look the way we thought it would or the way we wanted it to. Can we trust that impossible, beautiful things can happen for us even if we think it's already too late? Even if they're things that we would never have imagined for ourselves. We can't know the future, but we can trust that with God, our faithful, never gives up on us and never leaves us God. That with God, impossible, beautiful, life-giving things are, in fact, always possible. May it be so. Amen. I want to say just a word about our hymn of the day. When Brad and I were meeting this week, and we spent a long time looking for a hymn of the day. It wasn't coming very easily. Usually it comes a lot more quickly. And Brad was the one that sort of had this connection, or thinking about Mary. Her story has some interesting parallels, of course, with Sarah, right? With a miraculous birth, this impossible, incredible, unexpected surprise. And when Mary finds out in Luke's gospel of this pregnancy, she sings a song that we call the Magnificat. And there are many different versions that have been put to different tunes and settings. We thought that there's a nice connection. I think as you sing the words, you'll even see there's some deeper connections to this promise of God's faithfulness to us through the generations that goes all the way back to Abraham and Sarah to today. And so as we sing Mary's words together, I hope that for us they can embody and express the hope and faith and trust that we have in God, this God who can do impossible things. So as you are able, I invite you to stand.